Our scripture text for this morning is John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rite of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water," and they filled them to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw out some and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." Jesus did this as the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee, and revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So as the disciple writers made choices about what events to include in their accounts of Jesus, all but one passed on this story of this miracle in Cana. I mean, as miracles go, it wasn't all that noteworthy. I mean, it was interesting and it was even amazing, but it wasn't like he cured a disease or fed hungry people or made the blind see or a lame man walk. It wasn't like one of those. He just made some really, really good wine. Something they do every day in Napa, California. Now, granted, they take quite a bit longer and use grapes, but still. Plus, you notice in the miracle that there are no religious words spoken. There's no special prayer. There's no lifting up his eyes to heaven as you kind of expect in a decent miracle story. It's just fill the pots, you got wine. Fill the pots, you got wine. So it's not a surprise that Matthew and Mark and Luke all pass. But years later, when John is writing his gospel and he's going through all of his sources and picking which stories he's going to both remember and tell, that he's staring at this story, this wedding. And he keeps coming back to it. And because John is a theologian and a poet, when he looks at this story, he begins to notice things, begin to jump out at him. And like poets often do, he begins to make these connections that maybe others have missed. First, he notices that it was the third day. Wedding celebrations would sometimes last for 7 days, and on the third day, which by the way is fairly bad planning if on the third day of a 7-day feast you run out of all the wine. But John notices this third day, and so he kind of thinks about that a little bit more. The third day, and by that time, the third day would be quite a significant thing in the life of the church. Jesus in the tomb for 3 days. And then when he thinks of the 6 large stone water pots, maybe his brain as a poet thought about that large stone that was covering the tomb. And maybe that sort of began to make some connections for him in his brain. And then he thinks of Jesus choosing to use those 6 stone water pots that were designed to be used for ritual purification. And those are the pots in which Jesus decided to make this wine. And then he would think, well, later on, Jesus talks about wine representing his blood. And then he thinks about 30 gallons of each jug. That's a lot of wine. That's 180 gallons, enough for dozens of weddings. Maybe not the ones you've been to. But in that day, it was enough for many, many parties, and all John can think about is the extravagance, the abundance of wine. Maybe in his mind he thought maybe the abundance was what it was all about, the abundance of God's grace and riches and love and goodness and forgiveness that was poured out to the world. You know, John as a poet is kind of on a roll now. He's kind of seeing things and things are clicking, and so he's thinking about this story, and before long he decides, you know what, I'm going to use this. John would later pick up this idea of a wedding feast in his book of Revelations when he would talk about the marriage supper of the Lamb and talk about this celebration one day when all are gathered. John would even notice that the way Jesus said no to his mom at first, that his hour had not yet come. What an odd way to say it, John would think. Because later on, he would use that same phrase to talk about his hour coming, to talk about or to think about his death. And maybe even Jesus' willingness to fix a problem that wasn't his was a glimpse for John of the way his death would be later viewed as fixing a problem that also wasn't his. It's just the way poets work. This is what poets do. They make these connections and see these possibilities and observations and then write them. They make connections. They don't explain them. I mean, I wish poets did. I'd understand a lot more poetry if poets would explain what they're trying to say. But they don't. They just write the poetry. And they leave it up to the reader to explore and discover. It's the way poets do it. They want you to discover for yourself so you can feel what they felt as they wrote it, maybe. So John recounts 7 miracles in his book. This is the first one. 7 miracles, but he doesn't call them miracles. He calls them signs. Signs. Almost like for John, it wasn't the miracle he wanted people to get caught up in. It wasn't the event he wanted them to lose themselves in. He wanted people to notice what that event was pointing to, what that event meant, what that event was about, like a finger pointing to something else. He wanted his readers to not miss that these were signs. These were telling us something particularly about Jesus. We're in the season of Epiphany, and in a series of sermons that we've started on what it means to live a full, authentic, meaningful life. So all these Epiphany texts, we're asking this question of them. Is there anything in here, anything in these texts that can help us know something about what it means to live a full, abundant, meaningful life? And so last week we started with the baptism, remember? Those of you who are here, we talked about the baptism of Jesus and how Jesus got in line with all the other human beings. Just that same line with everybody else, with the poor and the rich and the hurting and just with all people. He got in that line and just walked forward to be baptized by John. Just that common line. And he heard that blessing from God in that common line for everyone. Just that exact same place where we must hear that first blessing. In that line with everyone else, we hear this blessing. Because it's important for us to not view this blessing as a reward. Remember we talked about that? But to see it as a gift. To see it as something that we didn't earn. Something that was just ours by nature of our birthright. This, you are my beloved. In you I take delight. You are my beloved. Not something we worked at, not like we tried really hard to be lovable, not like we tried really hard to be good enough, and then we got the blessing. No. We won't hear a blessing that way. It won't feel like a blessing. The only way we really hear the blessing is when we hear it as a gift for free from God. So we said this, we will never be able to feel important if we do not know that we are important before we do anything at all. And then today we come to this story, this water to wine story. A story that begins to point, or a sign begins to point to the uniqueness and the special quality or in the particular person that Jesus was. This water to wine was a way of seeing this unique individual who was Jesus. And so Jesus, John seems to tell us, lived out of this uniqueness, this calling, this special job he had to do. Maybe in the same way, we also have this unique road to walk. Now you might say, wait a minute, Bob, you're confusing me. First of all, you say we're all the same. Now you're saying we're all different. So what is it? Are we all the same, or are we all different? The answer is yes. Yes. We receive the same blessing as human beings for free. No one's left out. But as humans in that line, we are all completely and totally unique. The world will never see another you in quite that same way again. John says this about that. He says that this sign began to reveal Jesus' glory. I think that means that Jesus began to reveal his true self to the world. His true nature to the world. It wasn't a fake. His works, his life, his actions revealed the unique, particular, and special person that he was. I've always thought that maybe that would be a good question for us to ask before we act or do anything. Is this the real me? Is this the real me? Does this action demonstrate who I really am? We would save ourselves a tremendous amount of heartache if we just asked ourselves that question. Psalm 8 says that we, all human beings, that we are all crowned with glory and honor, Psalm 8 says. So we also have a glory. Different than Jesus's, but we also have a glory. We have a true self. We have our best selves. We have an honest self. We have a full self. We have a glory. So when it comes to being human beings, God dispenses his glory through us all in some respects. God is eternally creative. Eugene Peterson's book on Jeremiah, it's a great book if you want to read something. It's called Run with the Horses. He writes this: the Bible makes it clear that every time there's a story of faith, it is completely original. God's creative genius is endless. He never, fatigued or unable to maintain the rigors of creativity, resorts to mass-producing copies. Each life is a fresh canvas on which he uses lines and colors and shades and lights and textures and proportions he has never used before. I wonder sometimes what would happen if we were filled with that realization that we're not just recipients of God's blessing as a human being, but we're recipients of God's blessing as a unique, one-of-a-kind, never to be repeated human being. It's hard for us. It's difficult for us because unique doesn't mean perfect. It's hard for us because we have weaknesses and we know them all too well. We have shortcomings, areas of needed improvement even. But sometimes, rather than seeing those things as part of who we are, part of what makes us us, we view them as being design flaws somehow, that God slipped up or lost his attention when he was putting that part into us. Or worse, maybe things that we need to hide from or run from. I heard someone tell this story some time back. Imagine that for a moment that we're all in this big circle, huge circle. And God tells us that we can each get rid of one quality about ourselves that we don't like. We can each take that one quality that we think trips us up and makes us so frustrated and makes us so upset, and one that we just wish we didn't have, and we could take that quality and we could throw it away into the center of the circle. Just get rid of it. After everyone has a turn, we're told that now we need to go around the circle one more time. And this time, you must pick out of those discarded items something that someone else didn't want to have in their life, and you need to take it for yourself. So then we go around one more time. It went around a little slower this time around the circle. And what came as somewhat of a surprise to everyone is that everybody took their own weakness back. Some would say, and you can argue about this over lunch later if you'd like to, that we wouldn't have our strengths without those weaknesses. One of our college students on Friday night reminded me about another great poet of our day, Dr. Seuss. And in 1959, he wrote a book called Happy Birthday to You. Here's a little part of it, how it goes. If you'd never been born, well, then what would you do? If you'd never been born, well, then what would you be? You might be a fish or a toad on a tree. You might be a doorknob or 3 baked potatoes. You might be a bag full of hard green tomatoes. Or worse than all that, why, you might be a wasn't. A wasn't has no fun at all. No, he doesn't. A wasn't just isn't. He just isn't present. But you are you. And now, isn't that pleasant? Today you are you. That is truer than true. There is no one alive who is youer than you. Shout loud, I am lucky to be what I am. Thank goodness I'm not a clam or a ham or a dusty old jar of sour gooseberry jam. I am what I am. That's a great thing to be. If I say so myself, happy birthday to me. So consider these first 2 ingredients maybe as the foundation for living that full, authentic life that we all want. We stand in that first line with Jesus at his baptism and receive that original blessing. You are my beloved son. You are my beloved daughter, in whom I take delight. It's a gift, not a reward. And with that, we are set free from having to run around and hunt our whole life long for a blessing from someone or something else. We can rest in that blessing and know it is ours. And then, like Jesus did with his works, we show our glory, our real, unique, individual selves. We're not afraid. We're more and more willing to be who we really are. We don't fake it. It doesn't happen all at once. It takes time. Sometimes it takes a lifetime. We become more and more who we really are. And maybe in that way, by showing our glory, we give God glory. By us being willing to be that amazing person that he made. To show with our lives how creative he is. And maybe with all that authenticity, we become free to love and serve others because we're becoming less and less worried about trying to prove ourselves. So here's something I'd like for you to try. We'll be taking a break from our series for a couple of weeks because I'm headed to Central America. So for the next 2 weeks, here's what I'd like for you to do as we're taking this little break. Every morning, when you wake up, and you get out of bed and you go into the bathroom and you take a look in the mirror, after you've let out that quiet little gasp, pause for a moment and look into your eyes. Just stare there in the mirror and say these words. I give thanks to God for you. Every morning for 2 weeks. Stare in the mirror. Sounds corny, I know. Sounds too simple. Give it a try. It'll only take you 3 seconds. What can it hurt? 2 weeks every day. I give thanks to God today for you. Because I believe in my imagination, that when God sees you in the morning, he does not gasp. But instead, I think he takes your face in his hands and looks into your eyes and says, "Good morning, Bob. Good morning, Dick. Good morning, Nancy. I'm so happy. I'm so delighted about what I've made." That's what I think. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.